All right, thank you everyone for coming tonight to our Picket Lines Mean Do Not Cross launch campaign. Welcome everybody. As some of you know, we've been organizing this campaign for months now, actually. Just before the new year, we had planned to have this event in January. Obviously with Omicron, we saw it was not safe enough to do that, so we pushed it forward a few months. But for all of you who put in the work to get this event going, thank you so much. And let's hope we can have a good discussion and a good kind of start to this campaign. And this campaign actually is going to be a nationwide campaign. I know Toronto is not the center of the world, but you know, at the end of the day, a lot of us here in the city thought this is something that, it's an issue that affects, you know, in terms of what's happening in the labor movement, what we need to do to change the labor movement, to put forward positive demands, positive tactics into the movement. We thought it would be great to start here today for those who are organizing with us. So what is the campaign? What does Picket Lines Mean Do Not Cross? I think, you know, the title itself is a sentence, basically, right? It's kind of really, fundamentally, it's in that sentence in terms of why we're all here. Because, you know, picket lines, a strike, you know, whether workers are holding a picket line, whether it's a strike, whether it's a lockout, it's, if you look back at history, it's fundamentally, it's a basic principle in the labor movement not to tread on workers who are defending their living standards, right? And so I think with that common idea and principle in mind, I think that's why a lot of people are here today. Our first speaker is going to be Donovan. So, well, Donovan, I'll give each of you a chance to kind of introduce yourself and then go into what you want to talk about, okay? All right, give it up for Donovan here.
All right, so first I want to announce a great victory that just took place. The Toronto Raptors staved off elimination. We'll live to fight another day. Can put away the brooms. You know, this is as great of a victory for the working class of Toronto that this is. Obviously, there's a lot more fights to come, and that's what I'll be talking about. But before I really get into it, hopefully it's okay with the other panelists, but we had a bit of a, I guess, like a preparatory discussion earlier in the week where we kind of just shared experiences, shared notes about, you know, what we were planning to talk about today. And I hope you don't mind if I mention that the question of if any of us had personally been on strike before came up during the discussion, and we didn't really have a chance to get into it at the time. But I can personally volunteer that, you know, in my experience as a labor organizer and activist, I've been to many dozens of picket lines over the last 10 years, but I haven't actually had the opportunity to be on strike myself, to be totally honest. And to clarify, I worked for the Toronto Transit Commission for just about 8 years. First as a subway driver, and then, oh, actually, sorry, I mixed it up. First as a streetcar driver, and then as a subway dispatcher. And in my entire time there, I was unionized with the Amalgamated Transit Union, Local 113. And we got some, at least one ATU 113 worker in the house tonight. And I was incredibly proud to be a member of that union for the time that I was there. The ATU 113 is has an extremely militant history where it has, you know, in the past always been willing to go on strike to win real concrete gains for the workers. And the result of that is that the ATU has some of the best wages, pensions, and job security, and not just in their industry, but in the entire country, really. And I started working for the TTC actually in the summer of 2007 as a student. And some of you will remember that in 2006 there was a wildcat strike, followed by a legal strike in 2008. And some of you may also remember that in 2010, Rob Ford was elected as the mayor of Toronto. And he was absolutely determined to exact vengeance for the militancy that this union displayed. And so one of the first things he did when he was elected was to work with Dalton McGuinty, the Premier of Ontario, to take away the democratic right to strike of the ATU 113s through essential service legislation passed in 2011. And as a side note, I think this shows that, when push comes to shove, the Liberals and the Conservatives will always unite and work together to crush the workers in almost every instance. But I think, ever since that time, at the time, some in the union or around the union mused that, TTC workers, because they were designated as, essential, would be given preferential treatment, maybe sort of like the cops or the firefighters get, like automatic wage increases, et cetera. Now, the track record since then have been completely the opposite. There's just been a consistent stream of attacks, privatizations, layoffs, cuts, and just a general stream of management abuse and harassment. And so, I worked for the TTC from 2013 to 2020. And so I directly witnessed all of this in my time there, and, particularly because I was active in organizing inside the union at the time. Witnessed really how the removal of the right to strike really directly weakened the union in so many ways. And of course, there's more to the story than just this, but I think this is the starting point for another story that I'd like to tell today, which is the story of this campaign, how it came about and what we might achieve through it. And, I think, so I left the TTC in September 2020, about 6 months into the pandemic. So I've had personal experience working on the front lines in the early days of COVID-19 and working from home ever since. So, as a worker, and I think really speaking on behalf of all workers, the last 2 years, we've endured a lot as workers in this country, from the threat of getting sick or worse, being forced to go to work every day without adequate protections, social distancing, et cetera, to, the threat in reality of losing your job for many. At the same time as, all the very negative mental health effects of isolation and dislocation and all those associated causes. And, I think what has made this so much worse is the complete mismanagement of the pandemic by all levels of government, really from day one. Billions of dollars in bailouts for the rich. Meanwhile, working people just get peanuts, just enough to really tread water, just enough to pay their landlords, maybe buy some groceries, and that's about it. And, not to mention massive profiteering from the pharmaceutical corporations, from Amazon, and really the complete bankruptcy of the system and being able to eliminate a pandemic that really should have been gone long ago at this point. And so, aside from the war and the pandemic, and of course now war in Ukraine, there's really been another war which has been going on this entire time, and that's the class war. And this has really been going on uninterruptedly this entire time, and not only have the bosses mismanaged the pandemic, but they've taken advantage of it to go on the offensive, to instigate a wave of lockouts and, seeking major concessions, and really just, an all-out offensive. And I think what this shows to me is that, as long as we live under capitalism, workers will never be at peace. And as much as, I think the vast majority of us just want to go to work, go home, be with our families, be with our friends, and live a peaceful life, experience, I think, has taught me, and I think so many other of us in this room, that unless we make the decision to fight back and organize ourselves, we're always going to be subject to this, consistent stream of attacks and, a declining standard of living. And I think, so, this offensive has been going on the entire time, but it's particularly accelerated since 2008. And there's so many examples I could mention. I've already talked about the ATU 113 and transit workers. But maybe I can start with another one that's kind of a bit closer to home. The city workers of QP 416 and 79, there was a long garbage strike back in 2009, and Rob Ford, much like with the transit workers, once he got in the office, was determined to exact vengeance on these workers as well, and contracted out garbage pickup through the entire western half of the city. And if this wasn't enough, in subsequent round of contract negotiations, the city removed historic job security provisions for these unions, for members beyond a certain seniority. And so this was really a historic sort of concession with this struggle. And more recently, we've also witnessed the closure of the historic GM Oshawa plant, which is really a historic seat of militancy for the workers of Unifor Local 222, and also absolutely the economic lifeblood of the entire Durham region. And really, you know, for reasons of just callous profiteering by the GM owners. And I think, you know, the workers of Unifor 222 waged a completely inspiring and valiant struggle from spontaneous walkouts to a blockade of the GM corporate headquarters, which some of us with Labor Fight Back actually intervened at and were incredibly inspired by to witness this heroic struggle. But when it came down to it, the only solution to this crisis was the nationalization of the GM plant under Democratic Workers' Control. And some of us actually were working with Unifor 222 workers and pensioners we actually helped to present a resolution to the union that passed specifically for this measure of nationalization. Now, in the end, it didn't take place, but I think, you know, it was important that that demand was raised and adopted by the workers themselves in the course of the struggle. Another example, just before the pandemic, was the Regina co-op lockout in Saskatchewan. And this was, again, another really brutal offensive by the co-op management. And they locked the workouts out for over 6 months, seeking major pension concessions. And not only did they work with, you know, the local courts to enforce really stringent picket limitations, which, you know, all but effectively removed, you know, the right to strike in practice. And also, of course, they arrested a number of union members and activists, including, well, the now disgraced Jerry Diaz, for I think that was actually one of Jerry's finer moments amidst his, well, you know, other moments. But yeah, I mean, in the end, the workers did unfortunately give in this struggle. But I think, you know, you can kind of see the scale of what's happening here all across the country through these examples that I've given. And I think, you know, most pressingly right now, as we sit here, rising prices are eating into the living standards of each and every one of us. And inflation just last month reached 6.7%. So we're not so far behind the US, actually, which is even higher. And yeah, I think, you know, this is really largely the result of, you know, reckless money printing by the government, which has created this runaway inflation. And on top of this, you know, there's been really, you know, extensive government spending, obviously in response to, you know, the pandemic. And of course, this was necessary you know, this was necessary. But it does raise the question, with all this added government debt on the books now, of who pays, who will pay. And eventually the bill will be footed to somebody. And I think history teaches us that so long as we are, you know, under the rule of the parties of Bay Street, you know, those parties will attempt to make the workers pay the bill through, you know, any combination of public sector austerity, privatizations, social service cuts, and so on. And it's really, so it's, you know, it's really the combination of all these things, lockouts, inflation, austerity, that, you know, shows that whether we like it or not, as workers, the fight is being brought to us. And so the question is are we going to fight back? If we choose not to, well, then we will certainly lose. If we choose to fight, well, victory is never guaranteed. But the question then becomes, what is going to increase the likelihood of success? What is going to increase the likelihood of us coming out victorious from each struggle? And of course, this is a big question. But this is what we all come here today to answer in some part. And so I look forward to the discussion and hearing from everybody, hearing about, you know, folks' experiences of struggle, of strikes, and challenges in their unions, in society, whatever, what have you. But I guess in the rest of my time, I'm going to talk a little bit about history, because I think history can really show us the way forward in a really important way. And 100 years ago, I mean, today, I think the right to strike is really under attack, right? From back-to-work legislation to essential service legislation. You know, this basic fundamental right is really, you know, completely in question. But 100 years ago, even the basic task of organizing a union was illegal. You know, attempting to do this was enough to get you thrown in jail or worse. Many workers were just, straight up shot and ended up as really martyrs in the struggle for just this basic task. And so the first example I want to talk about is the Winnipeg General Strike in 1919. And this is really an incredibly inspirational episode in history. This struggle on the surface was just about union recognition for a group of workers at the time, but it quickly escalated, and they took over the entire city. And not a light shine, not a wheel turned without the permission of the extended strike committee that led the general strike. And really, it became so much more about union recognition. This particular struggle, it became a question of power, and this this scared the living daylights out of the ruling class in Ottawa, and they made sure to send the forces of reaction in wave after wave after wave until this struggle was crushed. And it was in the end. And this really, despite, again, the heroism, signaled the beginning of an all-out offensive against workers and their attempts to organize unions, which really went on throughout the entire 1920s and most of the 1930s. And it's actually quite similar to the Boss's offensive that we're witnessing today. So I think there's important parallels here, too. And but this was actually finally broken in 1936 with the famous Flint, Michigan sit-down strike, which rapidly spread all across the continent and spread across the border to Canada, first in 1937 with the GM Oshawa strike, and then in 1945 with the Ford-Windsor strike. And so, okay, what were these strikes about? Things we totally take for granted today. Union recognition, the union shop, the 40-hour work week. None of these things existed at the time, and workers had to fight militantly with every drop of their energy in order to win these things. And they did in the end. And so this was a really positive example, I think, that we can point to in history. And of course the question is, okay, how did these workers win these strikes? Well, I think you can kind of boil it down to like three very important things when it comes down to it. So first, hard pickets. Nothing got through. No scabs, no production, everything was completely shut down. Second thing, mass mobilization. We're not just talking about, half a dozen workers on a picket line. We're talking about hundreds of workers on picket lines, energetically staffing them, making sure they were solid at all times. And then the third thing is this, and this is in many ways, I think, one of the most important things, was active community support. Not just passive sympathy, but like, the local community actively organizing, fundraising, coming out to picket lines, and really bolstering them, much more significantly than just, the sum of the workers by themselves. And so I think all of these things were very instrumental to success. And, the response of the government at the time was, well, predictable. The Premier of Ontario at the time was a fellow named Mitch Hepburn. And he sent a request to Ottawa to send in the RCMP in Oshawa in 1937 to crush the strike with violence. And in fact, initially Ottawa refused. So instead, Mitch organized a local militia of right-wing and kind of motley elements. And these are historically remembered as the Sons of Mitches. And actually, the Windsor strike was even longer and more, really brutal. The strike lasted 99 days, and both the RCMP and the OPP were sent in to crush the strike at a certain point. And, how did the workers respond? Well, they organized a 2,000-vehicle blockade to completely block the streets up and prevent the RCMP and the OPP from coming in. And actually, just thinking about this is kind of reminiscent of the Freedom Convoy a little bit from recently, although with one important qualification. This was a struggle about real workers' interests, using real mass militant methods. And so I think it's important to remember that. Now, obviously, these are all vital lessons for us today. And I think most importantly, fighting methods, militancy. All of these things allowed the labor movement, really for the first time in Canadian history, to stand firmly on its own 2 feet. after 1945. And I mean, a part of this at the same time was that, you know, in the post-war environment, there was an economic boom, which allowed a certain compromise, a relative compromise, to be reached between the bosses and the workers for a short period of time. But really, it wasn't long before the bosses abandoned this consensus and resumed their offensive against the workers to, you know, take back everything that had been won. And this is really the history that we've been living through ever since. And so, again, I think, you know, the most pressing need is to return to these militant traditions of the past and to learn, well, in the first place, what they are, and in the second place, exactly how we can bring them back. And to be totally honest, I mean, some of these traditions, many of these traditions, have been forgotten today, or they're not actively practiced as they should be, particularly in English Canada. You know, just in the last year or two, we've seen so many examples of, with strikes or lockouts, soft, porous picket lines, you know, rotating strikes, one day here, one day there, without a clear plan for escalation. You know, other things like, you know, a lack of appeal for community support, a lack of broader mobilization, a lack of, you know, just basic worker education at all stages of, you know, preparing for strikes, going on strike, et cetera. And this is kind of compounded by, I think, just about finished, a lack of, in many cases, public understanding about what pickets are and why they're important to never cross. And in some cases, even examples of union members crossing picket lines of other unions, really, you know, owing to the same problem of, you know, lack of education and that. And so, you know, I think bringing back these militant traditions from the past obviously is a big task, but I think, you know, we can start today with this launch and with this campaign going forward. You know, we can work together collectively to educate a whole new generation of worker activists and worker militants in these traditions with the help of, you know, the leaders of these unions at the same time. And just to maybe close, if it isn't already clear, I'm a socialist. And, you know, socialists have a proud tradition in Canadian history of fighting on the front lines of every single worker struggle, and in some cases even playing leading roles in organizing strikes and winning strikes. But I think for us as socialists, we understand that every fight, every individual fight, is also a fight against the capitalist system, which, you know, will never leave us alone, will never leave us in peace until we collectively decide to leave it in the dust. And, you know, picket lines are really, I think, you know, ideal expressions of workers' democracy and workers' power. I think, you know, in a way they provide a vision of what, you know, the future society could look like, you know, once we get rid of the bosses, once we get rid of capitalist management, exploitation, and oppression. So regardless of whether you agree with me or not on this specific point, I hope you'll consider getting involved and helping out with this campaign because, you know, we really have a more basic goal with this campaign, which is to build and rebuild strong picket line traditions and really give the workers a real chance to win. So thank you.
Okay, so my name is Amina Sheikh, and I'm going to start out with, have you heard of One Day Longer? One day longer?
One day stronger.
Exactly. I thought I would start with that because I was thinking about that cheer or that chant before coming here because, ooh, I'm a little bit close. Okay, so I was thinking about that chant and I was thinking about all the picket lines I've been on, and I wanted to first introduce myself a little bit because I think to give a bit of context on my experience. So I was born in the East Side, and my family came from Pakistan in the 70s. My dad was a hospital worker at Sick Kids, and my mom was a physician. And my early understanding of socialism came from my dad, actually, who's passed. My dad used to read a lot on like finance, government, Islamic finance, conspiracy theories, you know, you name it, right? So I used to always read his books, and then, you know, growing up in Canada, my experience, and I'm sure many of your experience of 9/11, the Iraq War, and I didn't really see myself as an activist. I didn't see myself as like, oh, I'm an anti-war activist. I just saw myself as existing and being, and like most people my age and with my experience, and I'm sure many of your experiences, I just gravitated towards social justice. And when I graduated, I went to York, which again, my dad wasn't very happy about, because he actually moved us close to U of T Scarborough so that all of us could go there, but I ended up going to York. And the other thing that I ended up doing was I took women's studies. Okay, yeah. And back then it was called women's studies. Now it's called gender and sexuality studies. My dad was like, what are you doing? But it was my journey. And then my journey on campus, I met Fight Back a lot of the time. And thank you for inviting me. My experience with all of you has always been so sweet and welcoming and warm, and I just wanted to really show you respect. You're always organizing. I've always seen your booths, and you're always just warm, and I think that's very important, and that's why we have such a great turnout today. And yeah, so I just graduated, and then I was planning to go into development studies, but I really needed to move out. Long story short, I helped on one or two, I don't even know why I ended up on the NDP elections, but I ended up on the NDP elections, and then I saw posting about a job. The job posting was so vague, and I know someone's here from SEIU, because I saw someone wrote SEIU, but the posting was so vague. It was about are you an activist? And I just applied, and I ended up at an internship, and I got the job, and it was an organizer job, and basically from then on I kind of was getting an understanding of the union. I did understand I wasn't in the union. I left a part out. I was a temp worker as well. I don't know if anybody's a temp worker, but I was a temp worker at York, and York had its own temp worker union. And that also helped me understand the union a bit, because I remember I had some complaints, and I just found the union president's email, and I had emailed him. And I started to realize, okay, there's a thing called the union, and I should attend the meetings, and I'm a temp worker. We won retro pay, started to understand it, and then, I was canvassing for the NDP, again, just for a job. My politics weren't perfect, I'm just putting that out there. I just, I needed the money, and then SEIU hired me, and I was like, oh, whoa, I have my first salary gig, and they encouraged me to get a car. They encouraged me to start knocking on doors, and I was cool with knocking on doors. I just didn't know that I was knocking on doors for the union, and it was one of the most life-changing experiences in my life, because it really, my journey through women's studies and then the union, it all came together, and it made me understand the type of work, and it also helped solidify my feminism and help me understand that my feminism is through the union, and there is no feminism without socialism, right? So I just really thank SEIU, and that is my experience too of some of the first picket lines and strikes I saw, and I've been to so many, I can't keep count, but I wanted to talk a little bit about how strikes aren't easy, right? And I think some of you might be from some student unions. They're not easy, and it takes a lot of preparation and a lot of advanced preparation, and that is where my role comes in. And I believe that organizing is needed all along the route of bargaining, pre-bargaining, after bargaining, into the strike. We need to constantly organize, and I know a lot of you are organizers, and so you know why I'm saying this. And I'm saying this because what do we hear a lot? We hear that people are not ready to go on strike. People are afraid. People's politics are all over the place, right? In workplaces, your neighbors, people's politics are even more on a spectrum, more than ever, I would say. And that's okay, but that's why you need to organize, and you need to have conversations. And I just wanted to read one little sheet that I really like to read. It's from Jane McAlevy's book. I'm sure many of you have heard of her. But this is actually from 1199 SEIU, and again, I like to talk about them a lot because my entire method on organizing comes from Service Employee International Union. So I just wanted to read this quickly. Advice to organizers. It says rookie and then it crosses it out. Get close to the workers. Stay close to the workers. Tell workers it's their union and then behave that way. Don't do for the workers what they can do. The union is not a fee for service. It is collective experience of workers in struggle. The union's function is to assist workers in making positive change in their lives. Workers are made of clay, not glass. Don't be afraid to ask workers to build their own union. Don't be afraid to confront them when they don't. Don't spend your time organizing workers who are already organizing themselves. The working class builds cells for its own defense. Identify them and recruit their leaders. Anger is there before you are. Channel it, don't diffuse it. Channeled anger builds a fighting organization. Workers know the risks. Don't lie to them. Every worker is showtime. Communicate excitement, energy, urgency, and confidence. There is enough oppression in workers' lives not to be oppressed by organizers. I like that one. Organizers talk too much. Most of what you say is forgotten. Communicate to workers that there is no salvation beyond their own power. Workers united can beat the boss. You have to believe, and so do they. Don't underestimate the workers. We lose when we don't put workers into the struggle. This was taken from 1199 Organizing Conference. And this is the book I got it from. I just really like that piece. I always try to go back to it. And I think what I just wanted to tell you that, you know, we're in a great moment right now. Everybody is talking about organizing. We're seeing the wins. We saw the wins with Starbucks. We saw the wins with Staten Island, Amazon. You know, we're seeing these wins, and it took a long time to get here. I always say this because people are bringing it up a lot, and I think it's amazing. I think it's great that it's being covered in alternative news. You're all talking about it on TikTok, Twitter. I think this is so important, and we're never going to have mainstream news coverage. I don't even think that the Amazon workers are being covered in the news as much as they should be, but that's okay. It's our conversations and our media that we can put out, and I think that this is happening after decades and decades of neoliberalism, McCarthyism. I think I would argue we're in some sort of new form of McCarthyism, you know, and this type of class war, as Donovan said, is real, and I think it's every day, and I think that it's going to take years, and I think we're in the most exciting moment where everybody wants to organize and everybody wants to be part of a union. And I think some of the things that I wanted to talk to you about were a few strikes. I won't go too long. And before the pandemic, I think one of the big strikes that I was following, I'm from the teachers union, were the teacher strikes, you know? That started pre-pandemic. And those strikes were in places that people think are red states, right? And it spread. And it spread from people who were like, you know what, my dad was a coal miner, and I know what a union is. And so people do have consciousness. We just have to awaken that consciousness. The other thing is, it spreads in places where we think it's not possible. And when we do our organizing work, I'm seeing it now too, we know the election is coming up. It's like we need to organize where we think it's not possible. And we need to stop ignoring those who we think that don't need to be talked to. I think the biggest part of preparing for a strike, and a lot of unions do this, is structure tests and talking to everyone and canvassing everyone and not leaving anyone behind. And I think the Amazon workers organizing shows that. They talked about like just standing at bus routes, and I know you all do this work, I see it, okay? So, but like it's like standing at bus routes, talking to people who English is their second language, you know? Don't assume that they're apolitical. Also, again, like we can't assume everyone's going to be on the same page with us on every single issue. I may have an opinion on Ukraine, and my neighbor has a different opinion on Ukraine, but it's like we should still be able to talk. And I teach this to members as well, that just because somebody's anti-vaccine, are we going to never talk to them? Like, I say this to very professionalized workforce, like the problem that's happened and we've entered is people aren't even talking, right? And fascism loves that, right? And they don't want difference of opinions, and they would love to, like, this loud minority has grown louder and louder and louder. And it really upsets me, because I think that the unions need to be organizing and talking to all these people, because it's such a small minority and they've been given so much space and so much power. And if we don't organize ourselves and we don't bring them along with us, then the right will continue to organize us, and we can't let that happen. And I just wanted to say that some of the strikes that I was following were the teacher strikes, and for me it was incredible because it was in such conservative places. And also watching the Democratic race, like, I don't fully understand American politics, I don't fully understand Canadian politics either, but like the American situation where there were states voting for $15 minimum wage, there were states voting for jobs guarantee, there are people saying let's stop war, people have these issues and they agree on them, right? And so some of the teacher strikes helped me see that. Also, common sense bargaining, common good bargaining, like bargaining for the common good, sorry, that's the phrase. It's like making demands of the community part of your collective bargaining, and we're seeing those wins happen. And I think the teachers in LA, there were about 30,000 teachers that went on strike before the pandemic, and they were successful. They had real wins. They put nurses and librarians in schools. They have demands around policing, ending policing in schools, like getting cops out of schools. I think also these movements have shown us that maybe unions, are moving from business unionism, right? Maybe back into social movement unionism, and I believe that, but I believe it's slow. So that's why sometimes when I read things, I do think it's a little bit defeated and a little bit negative, but I think that we have to see that it's happening, it's just happening slowly. And I think some of the strikes that I was following too, John Deere, and the coverage is incredible. That's a strike that happened after 30 years, So look at what we've been through, and they purged unions, they purged leftists and communists and socialists for a reason, and it worked. And I think people are coming together and educating themselves, and we're seeing these movements happen. I think another major strike that I really wanted to talk about before I end was the farmer strike in India, okay? Yeah, inspired me beyond. I don't even know, Jacobin said it's one of the largest strikes in history. I believe it was. I don't know the numbers, 250 million, they're saying that's not true, but I think it is true. And everybody came behind them, okay? Everybody, taxi drivers, professionals, bus drivers. It wasn't just farmers. They do not deliver these stories properly. It was everybody. And it was making waves, and it pushed Modi, one of the most fascist governments, and pushed him. And I think that they made major wins, and we should be studying that more as well. And that's basically what I wanted to cover, were those couple strikes. And I think that we're going to continue to see strikes. And I would say that it takes a lot to go to a strike, and that is why we have to constantly organize, constantly have conversations, and have tough conversations with people who don't have perfect pure politics, but we can learn a lot, and we all have the same issues. Today I got in a taxi, and the driver right away asked me where I'm from. I'm used to this, and I knew he was Muslim, and he's like, how are you doing, what are you doing, how's it going? And then I don't know why I started complaining about Imran Khan, but he agreed with me. He was like, yeah, they'll always side with the army. And I'm like, yeah, they always just want to go to war, this is what it is. And he's like, yeah, exactly. And I just want to say that people really do, want respect, dignity in the workplace. And the strike has shown me too, the final thing I was going to say, is that across race, across ethnicity, across gender, sexuality, differences, we are really the same, and strikes bring people together from all walks of life, okay? Like sometimes too here, people will be like, oh, do some people not want to go on strike because of religion stuff? I was like, very few, like even they will do like make signs and stuff. Everybody goes on strike, and it's a beautiful thing, and it shows that when we come together, we do win.
Thank you. I'm gonna go to our last speaker before we open up for discussion, and sorry? Sure, yeah, you can do that. And just so folks know, one of our organizers, Renu, is helping us zoom in Sarah LaBelle. I'll let Sarah introduce herself and then go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
I'm like the talking head on the computer screen. My name is Sarah LaBelle. I'm very thankful to be here today, well, virtually. My pronouns are she, her. I'm coming to you from the traditional territories of the Mississaugas First Nations of Scugog Island, and I'm grateful that the land that I, live on, work in, and play on has been taken care of by the stewards of this land for years, and I am grateful for the land defenders and the water defenders who, have taken care of the land and allowed me to be here. I am the second vice president of the Ontario Public Service Employees Union. I have been an activist since I walked through the door at Lakeridge Health. My profession, I'm a medical laboratory technologist, and I've been working at Lakeridge Health since 2004. And the first day I walked through the door, I was at my orientation, and the individual who showed up at my orientation happened to be a board member for the Ontario Public Service Employees Union. And she talked to me and said, you should be a steward. And I said, okay. So that's how I got involved in my union. My personal history, I grew up, I'm from a small island from the East Coast. That's where my whole family's from, Grand Manan, population 2,700. And when I was 8.5, my parents moved to Brazil. So my first experience in Brazil was, seeing at 8.5 what abject poverty looks like, face to face. Is something that many of us don't see, at a very young age, unless, you live in a neighborhood that, it has poverty. And, there are neighborhoods in Toronto that, of course, do. But like going to a third world country and seeing favelas and people living in cardboard boxes on the side of a mountain was really eye-opening for me. And another thing about living in Brazil and moving there is that Brazil was not a democracy until the 80s. So I moved to Brazil in the 80s, and I got to witness their first democratic election and how thrilling it was for a country that had been under a monarchy rule for so long and had been ruled by the oligarchs, and they fought for democracy and they elected their first president, but they never got to see him take office because he ended up having a heart attack and dying of a nosocomial infection. But 30 years later, a little over 30 years later, Brazil then reverted back to an oligarchy under Bolsonaro. So it's been, a really sad thing to watch, a country that fought so hard for democracy to lose it. And so democracy is tenuous, it's important, and it's why unions exist, and it's their purpose and their goal as an organization is to fight for democracy. We fight for political democracy, we fight for democracy in our workplaces, and part of that democracy is having the ability to go out on strike. The Ontario Public Service Employees Union has been, it's been around since 1911, used to be called the Civil Service Association of Ontario, and represented predominantly people who worked directly for ministries and were civil servants. And we organized outside of the civil service, starting in 1969 by organizing in hospitals, and our union grew, and we became an actual union in the 70s. But the history of OPSU, the civil servants didn't have the right to strike until the 90s, sorry. So like in the 80s, when shortly after we became a union, one of our presidents was sentenced to 35 days in jail for his role in an illegal corrections strike. Now this happened in the 80s. He served, out of the 35 days, he served 3/4 of his time. And that was kind of the start of our, militant history in the Ontario Public Service Employees Union. And it wasn't until the 90s when the NDP government was elected and in office that we actually got the right to strike for the Ontario Public Service. And that happened because the Bob Rae government passed legislation to allow it to occur. So we haven't even had a long history of being able to strike. And what happened in the 90s is that the Ontario Public Service then engaged in an extremely large strike. I have a puppy, Annie! 7-month-old golden doodle, and she lets me know. So in 1996, the Ontario Public Service engaged in a very violent strike. We recognized the 20 years of that strike and the most violent altercation that occurred on the steps at Queen's Park when 35,000 civil servants were out on strike in the 90s. And there was an altercation between OPP and our members, and many of them were beaten with batons. They were knocked out. Some of them had PTSD after that, and that's the legacy of our strike history in the Ontario Public Service. And what we went out for in like the late 90s, the Ontario Public Service and the civil servants, they went out for the right to have defined benefit pension plans and have joint trustee benefit plans. And that was the impetus and the history of other joint trustee pension plans, which grew in all other unions and really has paved the way for really great pension plans for people who work in the public service. And the unfortunate thing is, over the years, what the government and the ruling class and Bay Street has done is they have pitted the private sector versus the public sector. And that we have these defined benefit pension plans, private sector doesn't, that we have these good wages, private sector doesn't. But the truth couldn't be further from that than, recognizing the fact that the public service has always gone under wage restraint legislation. It happened under Bob Rae, it happened under Dalton McGuinty, it happened under, Kathleen Wynne, and it has happened under Doug Ford. So wage restraint legislation has always impacted the public service. And we need each other, public and private, and we need to support each other. The start of the strikes from the public service in the late 90s, which was really the start of fighting the whole province, fighting the Harris government. And it was the start of other groups going out on strike, which then pushed for the days of action. And that was really creative organizing across public and private and cross picketing. And those are the things that we need to start talking about again is, if the private sector is out on strike and get legislated back, or they're being crushed on a picket line, then the public sector needs to step in and cross picket, and the same needs to happen in the public sector. Sorry. So cross-picketing is something that we need to start talking about. And, at the Ontario Federation of Labour, there was a motion that was passed that we were going to support picket lines and that we were going to support strikes. So we need to start doing that work and pushing them to follow through with the motions that get passed and resolutions at their convention. And that's just the start. I'm a medical laboratory technologist by profession. I am in a field that does not have the right to strike. I work in a hospital. But what I can tell you is that the power of illegal actions, when the members are organized and the members are mad, is the greatest power in the world. We, in 2003, the Hospital Professionals Division did an illegal day of action. It was not easy. We were in a round of bargaining that was extremely difficult. The Ontario Hospital Association was trying to break down our central bargaining process. And we knew what they would do is that they would take the smallest local with the hospital with the biggest deficit. They would take them first. They would go to arbitration and they would set the tone for all of the other hospitals. So our members organized, and it took about 6 to 8 weeks doing meetings. We brought all the presidents in. The president of our union said, "You'll never do it. The hospital professionals will not walk out." That's what our president said at that point in time, and it was Leah Castleman. Wonderful president, but didn't think we would do it. And we said, watch us. We told the Ontario Hospital Association the date. We organized our members over meetings. We did strike votes. We did meeting after meeting. We explained to our members what was at stake, why we needed to do it. We said, this is the date. And we stood out on a picket line not knowing if our members would be there. And they showed up. It was a historical moment for the Hospital Professionals Division. And it was a moment that, you know, is one of the proudest of all of our working careers and as activists, because we achieved so much in that round of bargaining. The OHA immediately caved. Hospitals had to cancel elective surgeries. They were scared that we were going to do rotating strikes and that we would do wildcats and just they wouldn't know when it was going to happen. So they immediately said, we'll come back to the table. And in that round of bargaining under the Hospital Labor Dispute Arbitration Act, part of what you do when you go in front of an arbitrator is you have to provide evidence that this is an issue that is serious enough that the members will strike over this issue. And we proved that because we did an illegal day of action and we achieved 14% increases over 2 years for our members. And we weren't even going for wages. So the power of the collective is really an incredible thing. And anybody who tells you that members won't do it is wrong. Because if you give people a reason, if you educate them, if you have the meetings and you tell them what's at stake and why they need to go out on strike, members will do it. They just need to be told that they're going to be supported, and they just need to be told that there are gains to be achieved by going out on a picket line. And that's what's been missing for so long. For so long, people have been scared to go out on strike because we've been told if you go out on strike, you're not going to gain anything, or it's not worth going out on strike because what you will gain won't be enough to make up for what you lost. But if we keep having that mentality, we're never going to get out of this rut of capitalism just taking more and more and more away from workers. And, you know, what better moment do we have right now coming out of this pandemic where we have proven in every sector, in every workplace, that this country cannot function without workers. We don't need bosses. We don't even need politicians, quite frankly, because they didn't do anything in the pandemic, but you need workers. Long-term care, we need workers. We need workers in transit. We need workers in retail. They kept this economy going. The migrant workers that put food on the table and risked their lives going into work in unsafe working conditions are the reason why we're all here and able to do what we're doing. So there's no greater power right now that we can harness coming out of this pandemic. And it's really time for workers to harness their power and to start making huge gains, because we've had enough of 30 years, 40 years of just, you know, making small gains, incremental gains that don't keep up with pace of inflation. And, you know, what a great start for all of you to, you know, start wanting to do with the organizing and having those conversations, because we can make some huge gains. And I see a really bright future for workers in this country and in this province if we all work together and support each other.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thanks Amina and Donovan for the presentations. We're going to come back to the speakers at the end of the discussion if you want to answer any questions or do a quick wrap-up for a few minutes. But with that being said, let's jump right into the discussion here.
One thing we have to realize is that nothing is ever given away for free to working class people. Going back, all the way back to the 19th century, we were never given anything. Back then, you know, if the bosses could use child labor, if they could work us to death, if they could do every bit of exploitation, they would do so. And actually that bit about work us to death, we've seen that in the COVID pandemic, that they don't care about the lives of working class people and they're just trying to get the profits from us. Actually talking about the profits, they are profiteering like you would never believe. Actually recent statistics have showed that Canadian corporate profits went up from something like $900 billion a year to $1.4 trillion a year, all off the backs of working class people. And now we're facing this scourge of inflation. Now, I think there's some people on the left say we don't have to worry about inflation. You really do. You really, really do have to worry about inflation, because working class people worry about it when you try to fill up your tank of gas and it's twice as expensive as it used to be. Your groceries are $50 more every time you go. Transit, rent, everything. So people need to catch up. Working class people need to catch up with the erosion of their standard of living. And what does that mean? It means there are going to be more strikes, because the bosses aren't going to be willing to give that away easily. And again, like we said, nothing was given away easily, nothing was given away for free. Everything that working class people have gained has been by fighting for it. Now, unfortunately, in the recent decades, this tradition of fighting has been lost. It has been lost, and that consciousness, that class consciousness in the general working class population, it's been weakened. And it's not just been weakened in the general population, but it's been most importantly weakened in the labor movement. Sometimes you do have unions criminally crossing each other's picket lines. And we've got to say that's not okay. Absolutely not okay, because a picket line means do not cross. And that's for the good of all of us. That's what solidarity is all about, right? And that's why this campaign, we've got to take this campaign, we've got to take it into the unions, educate people, win unions on a picket line, a no crossing policy, take it into the general working class, the general population, to make everybody understand that when one group of workers win, we all win. When one group of workers lose, we all lose. That's why this campaign is so important.
Montreal dock workers and postal workers in 2019 had their strikes broken by legislation. Today, workers are on the line all across the country. Sewer and water main workers, we have a member in that, in that profession, and they're in hard bargaining. And down at Union Station, members of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers are on strike now. They are signal operators, and that workplace demonstrates, maybe better than most, the difficulty of respecting picket lines because of the cross of different workers in different occupations in that complex situation.
3 years ago, our local was in contract negotiations. So were the teachers as well at the Toronto District School Board. I was called up from my local executive to take part in the bargaining support committee. So I was pulled out of work and worked full-time with the union to visit sites and speak with other caretakers, which is the position I hold, custodian, cleaning, janitor, to speak with other caretakers at every site west of Yonge Street, up from Steeles down to the lake, and just basically take down notes, any demands they may have for the bargaining team, any questions, updates on what's going on with the negotiations and all that. The time came when there were picket lines. Not from us, though. The support staff, we didn't go out on strike. We were on a work to rule, but not a full-blown strike where we withheld our labor. This was the teachers, actually, who went out on strike. It was a rotating strike. It was a one-day thing here and there. Nevertheless, they did it. And when they did that, the support staff crossed the picket line. So You know, the union leadership basically said, we're going to work, everything goes as normal, no teachers in the building. However, everything continues as normal, as best as possible. But on top of that, there was an email that went out from our union president, John Weatherup, that said that in the event that a manager or a supervisor is giving you the instruction or the direction to fulfill struck duties, those that would normally be done by a teacher, but they're out on strike, to kindly remind them that this is a violation of the collective agreement. Okay, all good there. And then it continues on to say in the email that once they've acknowledged what you've said and they continue to give you this direction, don't refuse work, do the work, fulfill the duties, the struck duties, right? And we will, yeah, shame, that's right. And we will support you in a grievance, in filing a grievance. What does that mean when you file a grievance? Normally a grievance is, you know, complaining to the bosses that for something you normally don't do when you've done it, and to be compensated financially. So in this case, the union president is telling the workers to fulfill the duties of striking teachers and to ask for money. So what does that mean? They're telling us to be scabs, okay? So, yeah, that's shameful. So, here we have a union executive telling us to be scabs. So I barked back. I said, this is wrong. They told me this is the best we can do within, you know, the realm of legality, right? This is what the lawyer of our union suggested for us to do, and this is the best we can do. Okay, so I said, what if we, you know, refuse, break the law? And they said, no, we can be fined. Okay, well, unions, the right to strike wasn't done by following the rules, correct? Right, are we, okay, so, you know, unions to exist wasn't done by following the rules. All right, we're a local, QP 4400 is a local of 14,000 members. All right, if we're not willing to break unjust laws, laws meant to break us, then what's the point, right? It's just a slow burn, that's all it is. So I put out a statement through Fight Back's paper and on my Facebook wall and shared it, you know, on what's happening, on what the direction from the union, like the direction we got from the union executive. And they told me, take this down or we're kicking you out of the committee. I said, no, I'm not taking this down. Kick me out. That's fine. This was something I was prepared to do. Why? Well, I took the position of being booked off full-time with the union, not to be a bureaucrat, not to say, hey, look at me. This is my union card. I have my own cell phone. I'm a steward, and I get to visit schools. No, that's not the point. The reason why I took it on, and I hope that everybody in this room, if you are a part of a union, and you know, wish to eventually get a position like this, it's not for you to flash this card or tell your friends that you once got to work for the union. No, you do it to build militancy amongst the rank and file. And you do what it takes. And if you're willing to get kicked out, so be it. You know, that. Yeah. So I got kicked out. You know, back to mopping floors and cleaning toilets. But I accepted that. And people, you know, all sorts of rumors floated around. Those comrades in here who work at the TDSB, and, you know, there's all these rumors going around that I got kicked out of the union, that I got fired or something. No, that's not the case. Anyways, that's a good thing, though. Because people said, you know, he stuck to his guns, right? Bruno stuck to his guns, and, you know, that's someone we can vote for. Okay, so here's the thing. There was an election recently for a president, and also for steward coordinators. These are stewards that are booked off full-time. They take care of an area. If I had gone up and presented myself for this position, I'm confident enough to say I probably would have gotten one of these positions. Would have something been accomplished if I was in today in an executive position? No, I don't think so. So I'm militant, I'm a Marxist, I believe in militant action, but I'm just one person. The executive is made up of many other people. And from a Marxist perspective, the right wing of the labor movement. So I can put forward all these ideas about not crossing picket lines and the need for militancy, but I'm just going to get swallowed whole by the bureaucratic machine, right? So this, in order for this to happen, we need to build amongst the rank and file. And that's what we're doing with the QP 4400 rank and file committee, to build amongst the workers. Thank you.
Yeah, like this period that we're living in has been compared to the Great Depression for very obvious reasons, right? If we don't fight back against inflation, we might have to be wheeling cash. But I think the comparison to the 1930s isn't only a comparison of the misery that we're going through. The comparison can be extended to a hopeful comparison, because there's actually quite a radical history of trade union struggle in the 1930s. Particularly, I want to speak on the Minneapolis Teamster strike of truck drivers in 1934. These workers were fighting for union recognition. And they were fighting in a city, Minneapolis, known as Scab's Paradise. That any attempt of workers to fight back, to gain union recognition, had been very quickly undermined, suppressed by the bosses. And, actually, how did they fight back? So in this Scab's Paradise, they came up with all sorts of very creative solutions. These were truck drivers, and so they had cargo moving kind of all around even the city. So how could they prevent, the strike being compromised to shut down production? And this is where kind of flying pickets got invented, that if the cargo was moving, the picket was moving to keep the strike going. And that was really successful in preventing Scabs from compromising the ability of these workers to shut down production. They even introduced a newspaper, actually, to talk about the real struggle that was taking place, to counter the capitalist media that was distorting the truth, to win people to their side.
I work as a railway worker, as a rail mechanic, but I'm not with TTC. I'm with Bombardier, Alstom, and we're not unionized. But I had the experience of working in the facilities where the union workers, TTC, car houses are. And funny enough, just being in that environment meant when a union worker would say a work refusal over an unsafe condition, it gave us a precedence right there in front of everyone to be like, well, you know what, that's unsafe for me too. And so it empowers you even there in just being in that kind of environment. I'm excited, very much excited about this campaign. I'm excited to see the kind of mobilization and outreach work that unions need to have, because we're not isolated. You're not isolated within your workplace, unionized or ununionized, and you're not isolated as a class.
The right to strike is one that has been really hard fought for. Workers have, literally had to pay with their blood to win this, and it's been completely under attack from the bosses, from governments, from the capitalist system as a whole. And why is that? It's because it's damn powerful. It shuts down production, it disrupts profits, disrupts services. It basically shows who's the master of the house of that workplace or that industry. Life is getting so hard, and this inflation, life was already so hard. And now I have workers that have shared with me, Jenny, can I opt out of my benefits so I can save some money? Jenny, I'm not quite sure, can I figure out, can I reduce my childcare expenses? You are seeing people really struggling to get by. It was already hard, getting so much harder. But there is hope. It does not have to be this way. The Amazon workers, the Starbucks workers, all of that incredible union organizing that is happening just south of us is incredibly inspiring that something can be different. And that's not just a product of amazing people. That came from workers organizing for health and safety during the pandemic, but it also came about with them with really bad wages, horrible working conditions. I mean, you get these horror stories of people couldn't even have a bathroom break at Amazon, and it's not only about the wages and benefits, that's incredibly important, But even in my own struggles when I've been active with the union, it also is about dignity and respect. We deserve to have decent life, decent working conditions. We don't always have to just be scraping by. And so within the labor movement, what I feel very strongly about, I think Bruno spoke beautifully, absolutely beautifully, to what we need to do within our locals and how we need to transform, and bring back these militant and class struggle traditions. But I also think it's important that our labor movement is having those internal discussions, but we're also reaching out to each other. We're also standing up for each other. We're showing up at each other's picket lines. We're showing up for each other's struggles. Picket